Well, thank you for sticking it out and joining me. I appreciate you staying through the day. What we're going to talk about here is there's actually two sessions that I'm going to do back to back. So in the first one, we're going to talk about integration lifecycle. We spoke a little bit about this earlier. It's the process by which you manage an integration over time. So how do you harden it for production readiness and then make sure that you don't do anything dangerous once it's in production, so reducing risk around that. And then immediately after that, I'm going to go straight into the security presentation where I'll be sharing some tips around best practice for securing the use of your integration platform. So just to recap where we were at earlier, let's talk a little bit about what the life cycle is. It's essentially this acknowledgement that just like traditional software development, integration also has a life cycle, and you need to be able to iterate and prototype at the early stages, but then quickly move to a place where the solution goes into a review process. It can't be tampered with during that review, and then ultimately have it published out to production. At that point, post go live, you want to be able to monitor what you've built out. That's going to surface through real-time notifications, through platform throughput charts and metrics, and then through transactional metrics as well. So, how many customers have been processed, how many failed, and then we get into things like error remediation around that, and then kind of closing that loop. You want to be able to extend something that you've built, either change its logic, add a new feature to it, add new capabilities altogether, and so you're back into that prototyping stage again. So I think this illustrates quite well what the trade-off between these two antagonistic principles is. In the early stages, it's very important that you can have kind of a high cadence of iteration, and this is something that we've been very purposeful about within the platform. So from a software development point of view, a developer works in an IDE, an integrated development environment. And the reason the word integrated is there is because it brings all of the tooling together in one place. And that's what we're trying to do in Flowgear. So a developer will write some code, put in a breakpoint, in other words, indicate where the program should stop, run it. It'll stop at that point. They can review some things, stop it, make another set of changes, run it. And usually within seconds, those iterations are happening. And so when we first started conceptualizing Flowgear, that's what we wanted to try and embody. And that's the reason that you can make changes easily. When you hit run, we try and reduce the amount of time it takes before those logs start generating. It's usually like a second or so. And that's just a very pleasant way of working because it's inherently something that's going to have a higher number of iterations before you're ready for something to go into production. But then over time, and especially once you have something in production, you seriously need to ramp up controls. So you need to make sure that the folks who are implementing have no capability to accidentally make changes that might break something in production. So lifecycle management is really around understanding how those two things trade off and how we realize that practically speaking in the platform. So I spoke a little around this already. Obviously, the visual design is a key aspect of that, both in terms of the steps on the workflow, and then we drilled into things like our visual data map, a quick map, where you're expressing the field level transformations. What we also do, which you saw with some of the demos earlier with Nick and Kyle, is we surface sample data for the product that you're trying to integrate with. So I think the example was Dynamics 365 sales. You could load up a sample and see what an order document looks like. So again, by surfacing that in the platform, you don't have to log into some third-party help center. Everything shows up exactly where it needs to be, and immediate feedback is that the logs are presented immediately so you can make decisions around what your next iteration needs to look like. So a fundamental underpinning to getting all of this to cooperate is the notion of environments. And customers are able to tailor these environments. Most businesses are going to use 2 or 3. Dev test is where you're going to do all of your work. Anything that you make a change on is by default going to only persist to that test environment. And then you have a controlled way to push changes through to UAT and ultimately to prod, which I'll unpack in a sec. But one way this also breaks down is that at the connection level, so when you're defining a connection to an external endpoint, you're defining those properties against an environment. So here you can see a connection to a Microsoft SQL database, and under the test environment, we have a database called test SQL, while under the production environment, there's a prod SQL server name filled out. So completely different set of details, but they're all set up from one place. I made a point a little bit earlier around just the importance of having separate environments, and this can be something that feels like it's an unnecessary amount of effort, but it really does pay dividends over time. It's not always easy to build a test environment of complex systems. Your ERP, for example, is quite a complicated one. And here's what normally happens. You've got an ERP in place, and there's a major new version coming, so the team goes and builds the new version, upgrades it, does the transfer, proves everything, and then they go and re-execute those same sets of changes, upgrade, change data, whatever, on the prod environment, and that's your cutover. And now you're left with this test environment that, at that point in time, it's actually a really good test environment, but a few months later, it's stale. You've added extra custom fields, business logic's changed, the data's months out of date. So there really is a huge amount of value in just considering how you can make sure that your test environment stays up to date on key systems. Another potential impedance to this is that it is actually sometimes hard to license something for a test environment. Depending on the software that you have, they might only give you one account to work with, especially if it's a SaaS application. So certainly reach out to the vendor if you need to set that up. But once you've done it, you'll never look back. And it will allow the implementation people, whether it's your own team or a partner, to move much more quickly than if they had to work on the prod environment, because they constantly have to be careful that they're not going to mess anything up. Every time you make a change to a workflow design, we call that a revision. As JJ mentioned in one of the earlier sessions, you're designing visually, but actually what's happening under the hood is we're generating a document. That's normally a JSON or a YAML document. And the point is it's a textual description of exactly what that workflow does. And in our new platform, you actually have the option of that document being stored in our version control system. And that's really powerful as well. So if you have any software development capability within your organization and your teams are already using a version control system like GitHub, then you can actually leverage that for purposes of integration. And that means that all of the tooling that those products offer, you can just directly gain benefit from within a Flowgear context. However, if you don't have that, or you don't want to use those source control tools directly, then the Flowgear console makes it easy to do the same things in a visual way. So here what we're seeing is 3 different versions of the same workflow that were changed over time. Normally what happens is a stack of changes are made, you move some stuff, you add some things, you change some properties, you run it 10 times, and then once you've reached a milestone that it's now succeeding, you will save that design, and at that point you're offered the option to capture a commit message, in other words, a short description of the changes, and that's what you're seeing under that message property. Again, we're borrowing from the way traditional software development works, so these are practices that have been well established for managing source code. You can see a quick summary here of the number of changes in the workflow, so how many additions and deletions. And then in this particular case, you can also drill from the screen directly into the source control system. That's just the way this particular environment was set up. But the important thing with this is that these changes are immutable, so they're a record that cannot be changed after the fact around how you got to a certain design. And this is very important when you need to analyze a defect. So if something's come up in production, you can actually go through the history of the commits of those changes and understand where that issue was introduced. That helps you resolve it more quickly. But it also helps you to be more strategic around preventing that class of problem again. It helps you more to reason around how that happened in the first place. Was it bad information that was supplied? Was someone improperly equipped to create the solution? And so on. Now, combining environments and revision management, we have release management. And what this does is controls when a specific revision of a design hits a specific environment. So as I mentioned earlier, as you're working in the platform and making these kind of iterative changes, the version number is increasing, you're saving that version permanently, and you can roll back to that, by the way, at a future point in time as well. But by default, when you're using our release management feature, those changes are only hitting that test environment. They're not going anywhere else at that point. So then what happens with release management is the team has finished creating a solution, and they can now send this to a QA team for review, and they can promote those changes into, for example, the UAT environment, where the QA team would take over, for example, and then ultimately the QA team can publish those changes into production. Now again, this is something that feels unnecessary in the early days. So some customers, and customers certainly on our lower plans, wouldn't necessarily start out with this, but a good point to start using it as soon as something has hit production, and then you can kind of build up your governance competence over time around that. We've also introduced some new capabilities here. So if you are an existing customer, there are some more kind of granular controls around how this happens today. So in addition to creating custom security groups against users, you can also slice security groups according to environment. So in other words, you can say these 5 people have the ability to make design changes against the test environment and then promote those changes into UAT, but they're not able to make any changes in UAT or promote out of that and so on. And then similarly, your QA team has a certain security group assigned. They are not able to make any changes at all. All they can either do is kind of a go or no go. Does this get to go to production, or is there some feedback and we need to go back to the beginning again? So this is the way that the platform kind of supports you to ensure that you're following an appropriate process from the top. Then there are some ancillary capabilities that we offer as well, just to support your governance process. A key one around that is the audit trail. So any object in Flowgear, be it a workflow, a connection, an API key, drop point interactions, activity logs, user permission changes, all of those events generate an immutable audit trail. And you can see these details in the context of an object. So for example, if I look at a connection, I can drill into the audit trail on the connection, who created it, when a property was changed, when it was tested, and so on. And then similarly, I can access a complete audit trail of my entire account over a chosen date range. So if you're doing like an InfoSec audit, that would be a key piece of evidence that the auditor will probably want to see at that point. I also mentioned earlier that we created dedicated backing stores and compute resources per customer. So what's really useful about that as a side effect of it is that we can give customers direct access to those underlying stores. In a multi-tenant platform, you can't have that because your customer data is mingled to an extent. But this is single tenant. And so that store, which happens to be an Azure Table store, can be published directly to you as well. So you're able to acquire those logs externally to Flowgear. You don't have to do that through the front end or to call our API. You can go actually directly to the underlying storage. So, and the same, by the way, applies for our workflow activity logs. So when you see a workflow executing and those steps displaying on the screen, those are what we call activity logs. And we have customers who will kind of slurp up all of those into something like Splunk or Datadog, for example. So it's easy to kind of create those pipelines. As your tenant starts to grow over time, it gets very difficult to track what's in production use versus experimental stuff versus legacy stuff or things that are being phased out. So what we also offer is a relationships insight. And this relates all the top-level objects to each other, specifically workflows, connections, drop points, API keys, and then indirect relationships as well. So for example, a workflow might use a connection, and that connection uses a drop point, and you can obviously interrogate this top-down or bottom-up. So what we're seeing here is one workflow, that SQL to SF at the top is the workflow name. And we can see that uses another workflow, so it calls a sub-workflow, in other words. And it also uses a specific connection that uses a specific drop point. And then if I were to go into that connection, I could drill that the other way and see that reverse dependency. And again, this is data that's available in raw form for people who want to egress it. But particularly as a productivity tool and kind of a house cleaning tool, it's very convenient to be able to reason about what is still in play or what might need to be deleted, or be culled out. I don't have a slide for it, but we also have the option to have folders on all of our top-level objects. So if you think something is unused, if something's been used in the past week or so, we actually put a label on it, so that's very easy to pick out visually. But if there's something that hasn't been used and it's not referenced in relationships and you're just a little unsure, you can just put it into a subfolder and then kind of flag that for review at a later point. It seems hard to understand why you would need to do this out the gate, but we have a lot of customers working with literally thousands of workflows, of which half or two-thirds are in play and the rest are not. They're experimental or they're legacy. So over time, it's very important that you have a way to kind of tidy up after yourself to keep some kind of control over what's happening. Once something's in production, we give you a bunch of different types of metrics. So here what you're seeing is a measure of the active workflows being consumed in the platform at that point in time. A recap again, an active workflow is just a workflow that is running at a particular point in time. So you can have a parent workflow that calls sub-process 1 through a workflow, and then 2, and then 3. And if it's doing that sequentially, all of that is only one active workflow. So what we're talking about here is things that are running in parallel. So you can see here how close you're getting to your max. Remember, our commercial model is around the max number of active workflows available on your plan. So a healthy tenant is going to sit normally at sort of 60 to 80% of max. Below 60, you're maybe underutilized. 60 to 80 is pretty healthy. It gives you a little bit of room to burst. We apply a soft kind of rate limiter if you go over. So if there's a very occasional spike, it will tolerate that. But this is something that you want to review periodically. Another quite insightful indicator is your error rate. So if you see your error graph starting to spike up very suddenly, that could signal that there's some connection that stopped working, for example. So these are kind of at-a-glance metrics that you can treat as almost part of your NOC to get some early indications at the platform layer. And then at, I guess, what we would call the application layer, which is where your solutions are sitting, you have the ability to create some charting around that as well. So here we're using the Flowgear key values, and those are being surfaced as either a pie chart or some other kind of chart. So what the key values do is they're a key way to track transactional and master data that's flowing through the platform. And they are exactly that, a key and a value associated together. So the key might be the code for a customer in the source system, and the value might be the corresponding customer ID in the target system. And we maintain those correlations with a timestamp on them, and then that forms the basis for this kind of reporting. Another thing that we're working on here is the ability to kind of create an error hospital, and this we're going to have shipped around Q3 this year, which is where you can get a listing of the transactions that have failed to process, and then actually have like a retry button on the far extreme of the table. And this is, part of our thinking around moving towards something that just gets easier to remediate. In a perfect world, nothing would fail. That's not reality. So, even when something's healthy, there's a proportion of transactions that are going to fail. Many of them will self-heal, so we already have mechanisms in place for a back-off and a retry later, but other things require some intervention. So we're looking at either a manually actioned retry, and also in some cases the ability to tweak some of the data. So for example, there's a legacy stock code that someone's trying to integrate. It's never going to integrate because the SKU has been deleted. In some cases like that, you might be able to tweak certain bits of input information, whereas right now that would be very hard to do. You'd have to go to the source application to be able to make a change like that. All right, so very briefly, we've looked at how we move from prototyping over to the build, the review process, separation of concerns around who is going to be responsible for initial implementation, who's going to be responsible for review, and then once you've promoted or gone into production, we're looking at how you can pivot to being able to monitor and remediate errors. Any questions there? All right.
Sorry, a quick one.
Yeah.
When will you release the version with the AI?
Oh, so an on-topic question then. Yeah, I think we're probably less than 6 weeks away for that. We're very nervous about doing something that's going to do harm or get something catastrophically wrong. So when it does ship, it's going to be classed as an experimental feature. So from within your user account, you can turn on experimental features. And then on our larger plans, you'll actually need to enable it at an org level as well. One of the reasons for that is around data and mingling. But all indications are it's pretty good. Like it helps you at least 50% of the time. And we've got some improvements to make on it. And there's some other capabilities that we want to get into it first. But yeah, probably 6 weeks.
In terms of the stats that you've also shown and taken through here, are they currently available on the current version?
all these bits
The
of
key
I know the
values?
retry is not there,
Yeah,
but the other bits,
yeah, they are.
the key stats.
And
okay.
we're actually working on kind of a much more fundamental rework of the dashboarding system as well. So what we have at the moment are charts that you can attach to specific key values. So you choose which ones they're going to be, and then you can choose what date range you want it to be over. But we don't have a lot of like drill capability. So you can't kind of get to a specific failing transaction and sort of see it. And we want to go beyond having to tie that to an activity log and actually show you the data so that you can make a decision around whether it's going to resolve itself or you need to log a ticket and so on. So there's a lot of effort being invested on that.
That's excellent. Thank you.
Anything else?